So welcome back to the channel. Like the old saying goes, there's no replacement for displacement. We're going to be stroking a Corvair engine. So my buddy's got a 1963 Corvair. The engine kind of blew up, long story short. So we're going to rebuild it, but instead of going back with the small 145, 102 engine, we're going to stroke it out a little bit and kind of waken it up a little bit. So, well, this first video, I'm going to walk through the parts you'll need to do it if you want to do it yourself. If you can't find a good donor engine, kind of like what we did, and you got to outsource everything. There's a lot of parts that are close, but not real close. You can kind of make them work, you kind of can't. And I'll just walk you through it. So we're going to start with the block and work our way out. So the first thing we got to do is the blocks. The late model block is slightly different than the early model block. And I'll zoom you in. See how that works. So here's the difference in the two. You can kind of see the late model block actually has a notch on both sides for the opposite cylinder rod end coming around and clearing. So you might be able to see, I don't know this for sure, and I literally just grabbed this block. It came in a parts car one time. Just grabbed it off the shelf because it was an early model. You see this little dent? I actually think that's from running a longer stroke in a short stroke block. So you can see it might actually contact. That's the only one that has that notch or that cut, but that might have been what it was. So a good example. You can run your early model block with the longer stroke. You're just gonna have to notch it out a little bit or grind, just so it doesn't do this. But luckily for my buddy, his engine, someone had already tore into it and actually put a late model block in it. So this is his block. It's already got the later model block on it, so we didn't have to do that modification. But if you do have a factory correct early model, you will more than likely have to notch out because you'll have that flat cylinder or flat block wall. So that's the first step. Either modify your cylinder. I do have a piston or a block that is modified, so I'll try to take a picture of that. Yeah. So next thing, you're gonna need rods and pistons. Here's the two styles of rods and pistons you can get. To your left is a early model. To your right is the late model. So as you can tell, the rod length are both the same. The late model rods are actually thicker than the early model. The other thing is the notches on the ends. If you can see them. Your late model rod will actually be pinched right here. For the longer stroke, I think it will actually come close to contacting your cam. And so in the later models, they squish this little beef up brace to clear the cam. So the early model ones are flat on both sides, and you take a risk of actually contacting the cam. So preferably use the early model or the late model rods if you're going to do the conversion. You might be able to get away with this by grinding and lightening and balancing the rods. Not 100% sure, but it is something to look for. So you might be able to use your early model rods, but the late model rods aren't too bad expensive, and it's a safe bet. It's upgraded, stronger, so you can go from there. The next thing is the pistons. Since it's got the same deck height, I'd like to say. Yeah. Since the engine has the same deck height, but they made a longer stroke, somewhere it had to get shorter. So they did just like the 350, 383 conversion, you put shorter pistons on it. So these are about 3/16 to maybe 1/4 inch shorter for the late model 164 pistons. You can also see like right here is a lot narrower underneath the skirt. Everything's just a lot shorter about the late model pistons. And if you're buying new jugs, you might as well buy new pistons and just swap them out. Especially if you get new rods and new pistons, you just completely throw those to the side. So the next thing you need to do is your jugs. You have three options for jugs. You have your 63 and earlier, you'll have a 64, and then a 65 through 9. So Let's start with a 63. It's easiest to identify them by this is going to be solid. There's no notches. Any late model 64 and up will have a notch right here. So if you have a good bore, or your early model jugs, you can use these. You'll just have to grind the notch back here. Once the engine's, or you can mock the engine up assembling and then just grind and clearance your block and your jug at the same time, maybe mark them all. But if you're looking at rebuilding your engine, you probably don't have good usable jugs without boring them. And so if you're buying new jugs, depending on what your application is, you might choose to buy later model jugs. So you have your early model and then 64. I don't have a 64 model to show you, but basically a 64 model is this jug dimension wise, but with a notch. That way you can run a 64 110 head or any 102 early turbo, any of those style heads will fit because this diameter is the same. So the difference between a 64 to 65 through 9, which is your third option, is actually the barrel thickness. So the early 64 and under are going to be a 3-inch 740 thou jug. And then in 65 and up, they actually increased it to 3 inches 795 thousandths. So they raised the diameter about 50 thou, which will help with heat displacement. You'll have a thicker barrel, they'll be stronger. If you're running boost, you got more gasket surface, you have thicker, it'll handle more cylinder pressure, all those kind of things. So we opted to run the 65 through 9 jug because if you're wanting to run a 140 head or a 180 turbo head or a smog head, like any late model 110s, you're gonna need the bigger diameter without doing a band around it. It just gets complicated. If your end goal is a 140 or a turbo, just go ahead and get the 65 through 9 and you'll be happy. So once you got your pistons, rods, crank, block, and jug, the next thing you gotta figure out is your head. We're kind of slightly on a budget. His end goal is to turbo a head, or turbo his engine, so we're gonna try either find 180 turbo heads or a good set of smog heads from a late model, because they have the same cylinder design as a turbo. This head I just pulled out of the parts washer, or makeshift. This is an early 102 head. So what we ended up doing is milling the chamber wider to accommodate the late model 65 through 9 jug. You can see that fits in good. It's actually upside down. Biggest thing to consider is this area and this valve cover aren't the same dimensionally. So if you were to just lay this on the mill and try to cut these, you'll cut them at an angle. How much of an angle, I'm not 100% sure, but you will jack up your whole alignment of your engine. So easiest thing I've learned to do is lay these face down and then recut this gasket area. And then when you flip it over, then you'll be on the same dimension as the head gasket. Also, this bottom valve cover area tends to warp a lot. The first head we did took 40 thousandths of cutting before we actually contacted this center bolt. The second head was about 20 to 25 thousandths. So if you have a real bad head gasket leak or a valve cover leak, this could be a banana on you, since there's nothing really to hold it tight. So you have that. Once that's done, then you flip it over, indicate and bore each hole, and then do a little face cut just so you don't bottom out if you do actually take any more out. So running a 102 head on a late model engine will give you more compression. The 110 heads are just kind of flat across without this hump. This hump will raise compression higher than, I think 9-to-1 is what the factory 110 motor is. So if you're afraid or you want to be lower on your compression, you can unshroud the valves a little bit on the sidewalls and start slowly take this hump out until you get your CC chamber and everything where you want it to run the compression you're after. We're running a little bit bigger cam so we could get away with a little bit more compression. So I'm just going to leave the heads like they are, run them, and see what happens. So And because of this combination, in the future he can just unbolt this head and then run any late model 110, 140, 180, a smog head, like any kind of combination he wants. Another thing to consider, not overlook, is when the engineers at GM stroked out the Corvair engine, they added a harmonic dampener pulley. So you can actually see this is a two-piece pulley with a rubber isolator or something holding it, versus the earlier model, which is the aftermarket, but was just a solid pulley or a riveted two-piece. If you run a solid pulley on a late model stroke, the harmonics of the engine could possibly destroy the crank or break a flange or something. And it's just not healthy for it. It's kind of a ticking time bomb. Always run a harmonic dampener pulley or a harmonic balancer, whatever you want to call it. You can buy these used or rebuilt through Clark's or any other one. This one actually has this is a new reproduction model through Clark's, and it actually has degree marks already etched into it for better timing of the engine. So the last thing to consider is the top baffle. This one was the one in his engine, and it's ugly. Don't run something like this unless you just don't. Just don't. So the early model baffles are normally super thin and will actually make a, well, this one's just completely shot, but they'll make that little whoop, 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 whoop sound, and this aren't very thick. This is about a 15 thou piece of metal, and with the longer stroke it's going to get a lot closer to these baffles and could possibly grab one and rip it apart, causing shrapnel going through your engine, possibly wipe something out. In the later model engines, they actually thickened this up to about 40 thou, and that's preferred if you're doing this kind of modification, just kind of a peace of mind. And if you're like us and someone's done bubbled the baffle up, it's best just to get a new one. So as you can see, there's a lot more into it than just putting a bigger crank in it. The more you dig into it, the more you'll find a lot of little things go into it, or a lot of things changed when they upped the stroke. The bell housing's also slightly different, I believe. Or where the seal rides on the crank hub is slightly different. I think it's taller or shorter or something, but we will be able to use that, and it's not that big of a deal. So if you like this kind of stuff, stick around, subscribe. We'll be posting a lot more of like the tear down of the car and introduce the car, stuff like that, building it. And if you want to see a better tear down video on an engine, I have one posted. It was a 140 engine I tore out of a parts car that was just terrible. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.